Hanging out. Good morning, and thank you very, very much for inviting me to speak. And I was not really interested in the Civil War until I moved out here to Colorado, and a fellow I used to do living history with said, "Oh, you've got to go down to Glorieta and do that reenactment down there." And my first reenactment had been doing World War II, so he loaned me his Confederate kit, and I drove down to a place called El Rancho de las Golondrinas. So every May, they do a reenactment of Glorieta down there, and that's what got me hooked. And so over the years, I have learned just by bits and pieces about the Civil War out here in the West, and it's amazing how people don't know anything about it. Even people who've been studying the Civil War for a very long time. The first time that I did the Gettysburg reenactment, I fell in with a Confederate unit, and there were a couple of officers in the company next to us, and they almost had kind of like a morning zoo patter going on, this lieutenant and this captain, and they looked, one of them looked familiar. So I went over and I started talking to him after we broke up, and I said, have I seen you in New Mexico? And he looked at me and he said, "I've never even heard of Glorieta." And this guy had obviously been in the hobby for quite a long time. So I gave him a little bit of an education on the Battle of Glorieta Pass and the New Mexico campaign. Basically, the Confederacy wanted to have a base out here or extend its influence out here. And this was really spearheaded by General Sibley, Henry Hopkins Sibley, and 1862 was a very, very busy year. And by this time, the Union blockade was starting to reach its stride, and you had many battles going on. You had Grant's victory, Fort Donelson, Fort Henry. You had the Shiloh taking place in April of 1862. You had the first Vicksburg campaign. So Glorieta and the New Mexico campaign, not as famous as these other campaigns that happened during 1862. General Sibley wanted to take the Gold Mexico.
Where am I going? No. Wait, well, excuse me.
There we go.
No, go back. Okay,
there we go. Right. Seized the New Mexico territory for the Confederacy, and a lot of reasons here, and I hadn't thought about the diverting troops from the Mississippi Valley to cripple the Union effort out back east. Well, what happened was many Union troops were sent back east, so you had volunteers out here fighting the Texans that would have in 1862. Sibley raised a battalion, about 3,800 men, and when they were first equipped, many of them were wearing civilian clothing, but many federal supplies had been captured in Texas. So very quickly they were issued federal weapons and equipment, and I'll get to that in a minute. So the Texans made their way into West Texas, and in January started moving into the New Mexico territory. And in February of 1862 was the Battle of Val Verde. And General Canby was in charge of the forces in New Mexico. And what Sibley attempted to do was draw Canby out of Fort Craig, and at first he did not take the bait, but the Texans moved farther north along the Union route of supply. And so Canby sent a detachment out, and there was a clash at Val Verde Ford, and it was considered a Confederate victory. The Union forces went back to Fort Craig. However, the Texans were very sorely depleted in terms of rations. There was many casualties among the horses and the mules. In fact, the 4th Texas was turned into infantry because what horses and mules they had left were parceled out to the other Texas regiments. But this also did slow down the Texas advance to Santa Fe and Albuquerque, giving the Union a chance to destroy more of the stores that were in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. Not everything was destroyed, but it really did cripple Sibley, because he was expecting to have much more in the way of supplies at both Santa Fe and Albuquerque. And his ultimate goal was to reach Fort Union and really equip his troops there, because the other idea that he had was to move up into Colorado and get gold to fund the Confederacy and take control of the Santa Fe Trail and even extend influence out to California. So when they got to, they took Santa Fe and Albuquerque and then kept pressing north. By this time, there were volunteers from Colorado had started marching in February of 1862 south, because there had been such a clamor for them. Now, when you drive by 8th Avenue and I-25, that's where Camp Weld was. Governor Gilpin raised a regiment of volunteers and nicknamed the Pikes Peakers. And he had difficulty, much like Sibley did at the very beginning, of equipping his men. And many of them were, at the very beginning, wearing civilian clothing and were equipped with whatever Sibley could get them. Gilpin, whatever he could get them. But like the Texans, they did drill very hard. They were, even though they were volunteers, they were gold miners, outdoors, or mountain men. They did have a sense of that discipline. So they did drill very hard there at Camp Weld. Now there is several businesses, warehouses. There's that big auto junkyard there, but there is a plaque on a stone right there at the base of the 8th Avenue Viaduct, saying that it was Camp Weld right there. So these Pikes Peakers started out in, I believe it was like February 16th, something like that, in 1862, and they started marching south to New Mexico. And they were doing it in leather-soled shoes in the snow. And they accomplished this in about 3 weeks. In fact, they covered the last, was it 90 miles, I believe, in 3 days, because as they were coming over Raton Pass and on their downward leg, they were told that Fort Union was being threatened. Well, the Texans hadn't made it that far north, but the 1st Colorado did press and get to Fort Union by around March 10th. And there they were fully equipped, and most probably they were wearing, from everything that I have read and heard, the long blue frock coats. The Union soldier here is wearing what's called a sack coat, and he's wearing the light blue trousers. Originally, this was meant as the fatigue uniform in the 1850s. This is what you wore when you were chopping wood, etc., etc. But this became the norm as the war went on. And then he is also wearing the federal issue overcoat, which many of the Texans captured at Val Verde. There were cases of Texans being misidentified, or there being some confusion because many of them had picked up these overcoats. And I have worn this reproduction many times around a campfire in New Mexico, and it really does keep you warm. It's also a wonderful pillow as well. So anyway, the Pikes Peakers, the Colorado Volunteers, marched out of Fort Union after they had rested and refitted, and they were going to, and they met up with the Confederates around Glorieta, because that was the best way to get to Fort Union, Glorieta Pass. And there was fighting at Hatchet Canyon and also Pigeons Ranch. And basically the federal forces were slowly being pushed back. There was a detachment under Shivington, Major Shivington, who would earn infamy 2 years later because of Sand Creek. He took a detachment of around 400 Colorado volunteers over Glorieta Mesa And initially the idea was to attack the Confederates from the flank or from behind. But when he got to the top of Glorieta Mesa and saw what was down at Johnson's Ranch, it was the Confederate baggage train. Well, this was just an incredible stroke of luck. They made their way down Glorieta Mesa and destroyed the wagons. Bob and I talked about this, and I'd heard this many times, that they also busied themselves with bayoneting the mules and horses, and there's no archaeological evidence to support that, no bones or anything else. And secondly, if any of you have worked around horses, you know how jittery they are. I don't think they're going to stand by idly while their mates are being bayoneted. And so probably the locals made out very, very well that day when it came to draft animals. So most or all of the Confederate supplies were destroyed right there. There was a sergeant in the 4th Texas Mounted Volunteers by the name of Petty Colas. And the second volume of his journal survives, and it's in print, but the first volume was destroyed at Johnson's Ranch in the fire when everything was destroyed. But he has a very riveting account of his experience during the whole New Mexico campaign, the fighting at Glorieta and then the subsequent retreat. During all the fighting at Glorieta, the word slowly gets back to them, the Texans, that their baggage train has been destroyed. They realize they have to pull out. Sibley was expecting to live off the land, and if you've been to New Mexico, there's really not much to live off. You're traveling along the Rio Grande, along where the water is, but even there was a mounted infantryman by the name of Ovando Hollister in the Colorado Volunteers, Company F. He goes to great detail talking about the poor quality of the produce that he saw and the growing, the fields and everything that the locals had set up, and they just did not compare to back east. So you can just see that there was not a lot to live off. And if the locals oftentimes did help out the Texans, Petty Colas talks about this many times, of their being aided in terms of finding shelter or being given whatever the locals had available, there really was not that much, so they did have to retreat. And if anyone has seen the movie The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, there is that whole series of scenes with that large Union prisoner of war camp. Well, that didn't happen. There were not droves and acres of Confederate prisoners taken during the New Mexico campaign. And of course, as you can see by the information here, the Glorieta battle did not have the numbers and the casualties in the battles that you see back east. But for the guys fighting, these were definitely very significant, especially to the Texans, because now all of their medical supplies were gone. And they had very little in the way of food and water as well to take care of their wounded, so they just had to keep moving. The other problem with their retreat was, as they were moving south, they had to go around Fort Craig. And Bob, that was through the Sangre de Cristos, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there was a skirmish of Albuquerque and Peralta, which
right.
forced them across the Rio Grande and down the west side.
But that was the other problem too, is that they had an intact Union force in their rear. And so they had to go around because they were also low on ammunition. And so you had more Texans dying from exposure, malnutrition. Was it the Apache who were mainly there?
There were certainly Indians around, I don't know.
So, I mean, if you were a straggler, that was good chance that you would be picked off. So by the time the Texans were done and had fully evacuated out of the New Mexico territory, about half of their force had been killed or rendered incapacitated. So it was just it's referred to as the Gettysburg of the West, and you may even think of it more as like the Sailor's Creek or the Antietam of the West, because that was the end of the Civil War as far as the New Mexico territory was concerned. And am I keeping up with the slides? Let's see here. So, Colonel, in terms of the opposing generals, Colonel Canby and Sibley like many of these generals and other officers, they knew each other very well. In fact, Sibley, during his time in the service out west, had come up with a tent called a Sibley tent, which is basically a U.S. Army teepee. And he came up with this in the late 1850s, and because he had sided with the Confederacy, he did not see a dime for his patent. In fact, after the war, he was still engaged in trying to get some money from his design, but he never did. Colonel Canby had actually been part of the endorsing the Army adopting the Sibley tent. And at one point, Sibley was also court-martialed, and Canby was on the board, or on the judicial board, and they exonerated Sibley. So I mean, these two had known each other and had worked together side by side. Colonel Canby was a generally very quiet man, very effective leader, and Sibley was known as a walking whiskey keg. And oftentimes he was incapacitated during actions during the New Mexico campaign, and this did not sit very well with the soldiers. And after the New Mexico campaign, he was given commands in fighting in Louisiana. Again, not a really sterling career. After the war, he was part of a program to send officers to be advisors to the viceroy in Egypt. And so he was an advisor to this viceroy in terms of artillery, but then he was only there for about 3 years. And then his proclivity for the bottle, he was sent home because he was just ineffective as an administrator and as a leader. And of course, Major Shivington, 2 years later, he gained infamy for Sand Creek. He had raised a regiment, the 3rd Colorado Volunteers, and these fellows were mounted, and they were known as the Bloodless Third, and their enlistment was just about up, and so they wanted to do something. So they participated in the Sand Creek Massacre, and so that did not look even for the mid-19th century. That was pretty heinous. That whole action there in November of 1864.
I don't know if you want to get into that. Maybe see if we have any questions so far.
Let's see what time do we have here. What time do we have? Oh, okay. All right. All right.
But if you have any questions for Sven, please go ahead and ask. We'll just finish up showing the park as it is today and how to find it.
All right. I said I would talk a little bit about the equipment and weapons, and in Petticolas's journal, he talks about when they were first raising the Texas forces, they were told to, they were encouraged to a long arm of some sort, a Bowie knife, and a 6-shooter. So I have here, this is a cap and ball 20-gauge shotgun. Now, you may be familiar with the flintlock, and that was susceptible to damp weather and just damp conditions, not as reliable. And there was a minister in England. He came up with the idea of a percussion system because he was tired of his hunts being ruined by his powder being damp and his losing his game. So he came up with the idea of this is the cone here, sometimes referred to as the nipple, and after you have loaded the barrel, you put this little percussion cap on here, right, like so. It's just a little brass cap with fulminate of mercury, and much more reliable in damp weather. One thing that was effective for the Confederates who were still armed with shotguns was capturing Union ammunition for the model 1842 musket, which was a 69 caliber weapon, and that had was called buck and ball. That had a 69 caliber ball plus 3 30 caliber, 31 caliber shot. They weren't as long ranging as, say, a rifle musket, but any unit firing buck and ball at close range could really chew up their adversaries. The Union forces fighting the Confederates at Valverde discovered at the beginning that the Texas fire was not as effective as it could have been because many of them were still carrying shotguns and pistols. However, it did not take long for the Confederates to pick up or be issued, some units were still issued these in, while they were in Texas, rifle muskets. And Petty Colas refers to these as mini guns. Mini spelled M-I-N-I-E. The mini ball was a cone-shaped bullet. And this allowed the Civil War battles to be as nasty and horrendous in terms of casualties as they were. Rifling was nothing new. You had men who were hunters, sharpshooters, who were taking round balls and ramming them down a barrel. However, it's a laborious process. You need to get a nice tight seal and in order to be accurate. Well, soldiers don't have that luxury. They need to be able to fire and reload very quickly. The standard was that a trained Civil War soldier could fire 3 shots in a minute. The mini ball was developed in Europe concurrently by French and British officers. And the idea is that it's a cone-shaped bullet with a hollow base. And this is, and it fits relatively easy down the barrel. And then when the powder that you've already poured down the barrel goes off, that skirt will flare out and grip the rifling. So imparting a spin, and a big thing is that it will create a nice tight seal. When you have a musket ball going down a smooth bore, some of that propellant gas is being lost. And obviously they're not as accurate. So a rifle musket like this could reach out to 200-300 yards. The tactics had not changed though. So forces were still fighting relatively closely. So you had many men being cut down because they're still fighting shoulder to shoulder. This particular weapon, this is a model 1855, and it has what you can see here, what's called a Maynard tape primer. And I'll get back to that in a second. When in training, you were taught to load and fire by the numbers. And it just, without doing the numbers, it looked like this. You bring the musket around in front of you, pull out a cartridge. These were paper cartridges. So you would have your powder and your ball in the paper cartridge here. Tear it open, pour the powder down, you'd seat the ball, and pull out the rammer, ram it home, bring it down. Now you use your pinky, not your hand, your whole hand, because these barrels get very hot very quickly. You start pouring powder down a barrel and it might cook off. So if it does cook off, your hand is out of the way, otherwise you're going to lose fingers this way. You bring it up, go to half cock, and you put a cap on here, and then you can, if you're given the command, you're ready, aim, and then fire. Or if you're all loaded, you can go back to the shoulder. So troops were drilled in this constantly, how to load and fire in what they called 9 times very quickly. And the Maynard tape primer was an attempt to obviate the step of putting the cap on the cone. And so there's a little roll of caps here, just like very similar to a cap gun. So when you cocked it, it would advance these onto the cone, and they generally did not stand up well in the field, however. And let's see here. They were still drilling with the bayonet. And so there were manuals for all of this. So you were taught how to attack and defend using a bayonet. And well, what happened was many of the officers were picturing battles, especially back east, that were very much like the European battles. When you had infantry regiments and battalions forming square to defend against cavalry, and glorious bayonet charges. Well, because of the mini ball, because you're able to savage your enemy much farther away, you did not have the glorious bayonet charges that you saw in earlier conflicts. However, this is still a very effective psychological weapon. And it's also makes a great candlestick. You just stick it in the ground in your tent and just stick the candle right in there, and it works very, very well. And the equipment that I'm wearing here, now I've been issued a federal cartridge box and a cap pouch. I have my own civilian belt, and I have procured for myself a cap and ball pistol. Now, this is a replica of a model 1860 Colt, and I believe you have a Dragoon over there. Oh, it's not a Dragoon. Oh,
No, it's a Navy.
oh, Colt Navy. Okay. And so the Army Colt is 44 caliber. The Navy is 36 caliber, if I remember correctly. Bob.
Yeah.
Okay. And so with this, you generally be officers would carry these, and many soldiers would find that carrying early in the war, when both sides were procuring as many weapons as they could, soldiers who had been issued long arms and still had a pistol found this was just extra weight to carry around. So they would find a way of getting rid of this because their musket was much more effective, and they weren't closing with the enemy. But this was, you load your cartridges here, and brass cartridges are starting to come out during the Civil War, but because there were so many rifle muskets and smoothbore muskets made, it was very difficult, especially for the Union, even though they had the wherewithal to try and change horses in midstream, because you've got all these perfectly good muskets. Why try and change that? So put the powder and the ball in here, and you tamp it down, and oftentimes they would leave the 6-chamber unloaded as safety. Because when you're carrying this thing around, you drop it or whatever, it's just, you risk having the hammer fall down onto a loaded chamber and going off. Like I said, many Texans had outfitted themselves with a federal overcoat, and Petty Colas, this saved him from being killed or captured during the fighting at Pigeon's Ranch. He was mistaken for a Union soldier, and he was told by an officer, he's like, you need to watch out, those people over there are going to shoot you. And he said, well, I'll go take a look. And so he was able to leave, and he acted just very calm and cool, and because of his overcoat, he was able to pull it off that he was a Union soldier and avoid being captured. Now I'm wearing a civilian haversack, and again, it would probably have been very quickly replaced by capturing a Union, what they call a painted cloth or tarred haversack. And this would keep your food relatively dry, and oftentimes these would become very nasty. There's no Ziploc bags, nothing like that. So if you're issued bacon or anything else like that, that goes in here, and so you don't want to keep anything very valuable in here along with your food. And I have a wooden Gardner pattern canteen here. Again, may have been very quickly replaced by a captured federal canteen. Holds roughly a quart of water. And I have on the side here, since the space in the haversack is very precious, a canteen half, and use this as a plate. Let's see, so there's that. And now I have not heard, have you, Bob, about the Colorado volunteers being issued the double bag knapsacks?
I have no idea.
Okay. Bob and I talked at great length about what is known and what isn't known in terms of what both sides were issued. However, this is a knapsack of the period. It's called a double bag knapsack. So in one side here I have my extra pair of underwear, some socks, and my toiletries. And on the other side I have my rubber, or what they call gum blanket. And Mr. Goodyear in 1844 came up with the vulcanization process and suddenly made gum or rubber usable. So Union soldiers were issued these, and these were very valued by Confederate soldiers who captured them because it makes a nice brown cloth, and it has grommets, so you can actually make an impromptu shelter out of it, and you can roll your wool blanket up in it in a horseshoe roll and throw it over your shoulder. And for the cavalry, there was ponchos that had a slit in the middle, and you could just wear this to protect you from the rain. And of course the wool blanket, again, this is something that Texans would capture as much as they could, especially if you've been to New Mexico in February and March. It's still not very warm there. Excuse me. And let's see. Do you have any questions so far? Yes.
When we started talking about the weapons, you started with a double-barrel musket, and then you went to the longer on the single barrel. And I was thinking the double-barrel musket was a slight advantage, being able to fire two shots preferably close together as opposed to a single.
Right.
But I see the barrel is at least 12 inches longer, which makes me think it's a longer range weapon.
It is. The rifle musket is longer ranging, and the barrel is, like I said, rifled. So you are able to hit your target at a much longer range. The shotgun was effective at close range, and especially back east, the Confederate cavalry found these to be very handy in terms of riding up and being able to deliver a broadside against their enemy, and then galloping away. Because even if they did capture Union cavalry breech-loading weapons, they were only as good as they had ammunition for them, because the South didn't have the capacity to make brass or copper-cased ammunition. So yes, this is a short-range weapon because it is a smooth bore, and it will just shoot shot.
Okay. So actually, it then became replaced by
Right. Because
so much for twin barrel.
right. Yes.
Maybe prohibited too.
Well, if I could make
Sure.
a couple of comments. Both the Confederates and the Union were re-equipped, if you will. The Union, Fort Union, was the quartermaster depot for the whole Southwest. So when the 1st Colorado and other troops arrived there, they were either re-equipped or at least updated with what they had. The Confederates, when they got to Fort Bliss had been obviously a Northern Army fort, was quickly surrendered by a man named David Twiggs. And the Southerners will probably issue the mini rifles for the 1855 there. Archaeological evidence at Glorieta and Apache Canyon pretty much indicate that both sides were primarily using some form of a mini rifle. My wife's aunt's husband, his grandfather was a captain in the 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles, and he commanded Fort Davis down in Texas. And I didn't bring it, but I have a list of the uniforms he issued to his company. And they were all Union uniforms. And there's usually the notation on them, moth-eaten. But, so, probably the Confederates and the Union were, at least for the most part, armed with the mini rifle of some sort, and at least to some extent, as Ben pointed out, some form of at least Union overcoats for the Confederates. Can I talk a little
Sure.
bit about what I brought? I brought some items that, and you're free to look at them after the talk that relate to the New Mexican campaign. The pistol that's been mentioned is actually a copy of a Colt, the 36 caliber so-called Navy. And all the Navy means is 36 caliber. Did not mean that it was issued to the Navy. That goes back to way before the war. When revolvers first came out, the Army wanted a heavier gun, 44 caliber, so that became the Army. The Navy wanted a lighter gun, 36 caliber, that became the Navy. The Navy used Army, the Armies used Navies. Really neat. This revolver and the holster were owned by this man, Bruce McCoy Baird. Bruce McCoy Baird has an interesting history. He's been, some people, like I knew a lawyer in the Denver area. Bruce McCoy Baird was a lawyer. When I mentioned I had Baird's gun, he said, oh, he was quite a scoundrel, wasn't he? And he probably was. He was a Texan, at least by adoption. He served in the Mexican War and was made judge of Santa Fe County, Texas. Now, you know where Santa Fe County, Texas is. You're sitting in it.
Oh, that's right.
After the Mexican War, Texas had this great land claim that went all the way up the Front Range into Wyoming. Because of the service in the Mexican War, he was appointed judge of Santa Fe County, the county seat being Santa Fe. When he got there, he said, I am the judge, and they said, like hell you are. And anyway, he settled there. And he, Sven mentioned Pedicolis. Pedicolis not only kept a diary or a journal, but made illustrations. And his command camped on Baird's Ranch. And I've got a drawing here, a replica of a drawing that Pedicolis made of Baird's Ranch. After the Confederates retreated down into Albuquerque, Baird and his family decided they were probably persona non grata and joined the Confederate Army. His wagons and what remained of the Confederate wagon train was captured or destroyed at Peralta, and he and his family were forced to go down basically a Trail of Tears on the west side of the Rio Grande down to El Paso, where he joined the Confederate Army and became a colonel of something called the 4th Arizona Cavalry. I brought up remains of a saber that was found by a woman back in the 1940s who lived down in the Glorieta area and found this around Johnson's Ranch where the Confederate wagon train was burned. Here I have a bird, a Sharp's carbine bullet, 69 caliber round ball, and an iron canister shot, all from the General Glorieta battlefield. The last, I have a Confederate C button for cavalry, which was found at Fort Stanton, New Mexico, probably lost by someone in the 2nd Texas Cavalry, occupied Fort Stanton, at least briefly. If you have any questions later, I'd be glad to answer them, and feel free to come and look at these items.
Thank you, Bob. And, oh, yes. Go ahead.
At the beginning, you mentioned the Bowie knife. How is it?
Well, depending on its size, now I have a largish example here. Again, this is something that you see guys, glowering at the camera with when they went to have their image struck. Depending on how big it was, it could be also dictated how useful it was. Something like this for close combat, very nice, but are you going to actually close with the enemy? That happened here and there. Again, this might be something that would get pitched later on. However, Petticolas did talk about procuring for himself a 2-foot long, he called it a sword. Yes, and so, but if you had something smaller, it was more effective as a cooking and eating tool. There is a wonderful book called Cyclag and His Pard, and it's a fictitious account of a Indiana farm boy who joins the Union Army, and as such was the case early in the war, he was given many items. He was given a Bible, a nice brush kit, all sorts of everything he could carry that were the comforts of home. And one of the things he was given was a large Bowie knife. And it very, very quickly became useless because he had nothing to sharpen it with. And it was just something, and the author, who was a Union veteran, goes into great detail about how the road was just littered with quilts and Bibles and brushes and coffee pots and all these things that men would either cram into or tie onto their knapsacks. So when this is what you're traveling on, you get very, very picky about what you're going to carry. And you get very creative as to how you use what you're carrying. Did I see another question or no? Okay. Oh, yes.
Are the pants really striped or are they solid?
No, they're solid. And the fellow who dyed these, I don't remember what color they were, but he dyed them, and he was kind of creeped out because he said they looked like concentration camp pants. But he traded these to me for a bunch of World War II artifacts that I had. So these are very nice soft wool. But yeah, I love wearing them because they're just so loud. Yes, sir.
Evidently, they made different sizes of the Bowie knife, or they didn't just go to the original size and use them.
No, and I think that I don't know if that would depend on the smith.
Well, the term Bowie became very generic.
Right.
It could be anything, and they were not issued. They were a private purchase type of thing. It could be anything from this long to that long. I've had originals that are pretty close to that long, and usually they're in pretty good condition because they're so darn heavy that I think the first march, probably, as Sven said, probably they were quickly discarded. At the very beginning of the war, as Sven pointed out, families would give things to soldiers that, well, you need to have this, you need to have that, and they, as Sven said, they quickly found out after the first 25 miles that a lot of that stuff became superfluous. We have a picture back in the Civil War display of a Union First Sergeant wearing all kinds of stuff, and I have the feeling that he had that picture taken the day after he had his uniform issued. And he put on everything possible to have the picture taken and threw all of it away after the first march. But
And oftentimes the best quartermaster for a Confederate regiment or a unit was a Union unit that had passed through the area earlier. And I've read about men that would try to, during the summertime, should I keep the coat or should I keep the blanket? Sometimes they might, later on to their discomfort, would pitch both, and they would have nothing to cover themselves with when the weather got nasty. Yes?
yeah, that happened famously at the Battle of Fort Donelson.
Right. Yeah.
That was in February, November, February, I guess. Anyway, it doesn't make any difference. But the Union troops, it was a very warm day, and they figured summer's coming. And they threw away their overcoats and their blankets and whatnot. And the next night froze to death, literally. Well, we did.
And one of the things that's been a great teaching tool for me is, since we're also one of the slides is about the battlefield today, there isn't much left. Of course, there wasn't, in the beginning, there wasn't really that much out there to begin with. However, Pigeons Ranch is not public access, but the main building is still there, where the some of the heaviest fighting took place. The National Park Service at Pecos National Historic Park, there is a Kozlowskis Ranch, and every March, right around the anniversary of the Battle of Glorieta Pass, they have a Living History Weekend. So that's become one of the events I do every year. Is we go down there and we set up our tents and we spend a couple of days right there at Kozlowskis Ranch. And we talk to the public, we give musket and artillery demonstrations, and it's just something I look forward to, and it's kind of like my birthday present because I was born near the end of March. And I've thoroughly enjoyed going down there and being able to camp at a spot where that's connected to the battle is just also a thrill in and of itself. And Kozlowski was a dragoon. He was a mounted infantryman in the 1850s. He was a Polish immigrant, and he settled out here after his service. And during the Battle of Glorieta, he allowed his tavern to be used as a field hospital. And so I've learned much from the being there and from the Rangers, and also from the other people who participate there. Yes.
I might point out that Sven has been mentioning ranches. Why were they important? Because they were where the water was. And so on the Santa Fe Trail, water, of course, was very important. There was a well at Kozlowskis Ranch. There was one at Pigeons Ranch, and also at Johnson's Ranch. So that's why these areas are so important.
And
just a comment here. The little dotted line here really represents the Santa Fe Trail, leading on to Santa Fe. And as you can see in both of them, key stretches go right along where there's a water source. And if you just kind of look at it, this reflected the battle, and kind of look at the shape of that. And lo and behold, it mirrors quite closely along what I-25 is today.
right.
So if you drove down I-25 to go to Santa Fe, down toward there, during this stretch, you're right along where the battlefield was.
And interesting, at Pigeons Ranch, where heavy fighting was, John, it was a fellow working on an extension to his home, or was he building a home?
Well, he was, this was about 20 years ago. A gentleman was extending his back porch and had a front end loader who was working with some type of machinery in his backyard and uncovered a mass grave. Archaeologists came in from the state of New Mexico and volunteers, and they uncovered, I believe, 25 bodies. 3 of them were able to be identified. One of them was Major Shropshire, who was killed during the battle. They were all Confederate troops. And the 3 that were identified were placed in separate coffins, or Major Shropshire's remains were sent home, UPS, by the way. And, I told that to a friend of mine who does Union reenacting. He said, well, they couldn't send him Federal Express. So Major Shropshire went home to his family cemetery in Kentucky. The other gentlemen who were found, the unidentified ones, their remains were put in one big casket, and the other 2 gentlemen who are identified were put in separate caskets. And we had an all-night vigil at the old library in Santa Fe where the caskets were. And then the next day they were placed on wagons. We took them out to the National Cemetery where they were reinterred there with appropriate markers. So that's where they are now. Yeah, Bob.
Just one comment on that. The local reenactor, who remained idea that some Confederates wore the U.S. belt buckle upside down was just a myth until he was shown that mass grave, and I believe there were two bodies there that had the U.S. belt buckle upside down.
Right.
So he did a couple of gulps right about that and decided perhaps, not entirely was he wrong, but maybe he was wrong.
Well, and from the buttons and from remains of the clothing that were intact, it proved that the Confederates were wearing a lot of federal uniforming. Yeah.
What month do you go down to Texas to do that?
New Mexico, I do in March.
Oh, so that doesn't really, it's not really warm then.
No, it's not. In fact, in terms of people who do this hobby, there are people who are really hardcore and will just use whatever they can carry. And since I'm the only person driving down and back, and it's a 6-hour drive, I have to have some sleep. So I have a sleeping bag in my tent. We set up camp down there. In fact, the unit I'm with, the 1st Colorado Volunteers, we have a replica Sibley tent, that teepee, that big canvas teepee that General Sibley invented. We have one of those, and I took that one down, and you can fit 12, 15 guys in that. And it actually has its own cone-shaped stove as well, and the pipe goes up through the top, and we all sleep with our feet toward the fire, like spokes on a wheel. And despite the size of them, how tall do you think they are?
Oh, probably about 16 feet.
Something, yeah.
18 feet.
The first time I set one up was in the dark by the light of headlights. It was 4 of us, and they go up very quickly. And they're very, very comfortable. They're even more comfortable if you're able to stockade them or make a low wooden wall and basically raise it up a little bit more, so it's easier to walk around in because you have the slanted roof. Problem is they only have one entrance, so if you're on the opposite side of the entrance and it's your turn to pull watch, you've got to try not to step on the guys as you're going around. So that was one of the problems with them. You've probably heard of pup tents. The origination of pup tents came from the dog tents that Union soldiers were issued after 1862 because the Union Army realized they needed to move more quickly, and all of these Sibley tents and these large wedge or A-frame tents, they take up a lot of space and weight in their wagons. And the more wagons you have, the slower you're going to move. So what they started doing was leaving these big tents behind, and they were issuing men a piece of canvas about 5 foot by 6 foot, and you would button it together with another fellow and set it up that way. And so guys started calling them dog tents because there's barely enough room for a dog to walk in, make a circle, and go to sleep. And over the years, that became pup tent. And that design, the idea the Army kept up until the 1980s with 2 pieces that you'd button or snap together with somebody else. And by, I think, the 1870s, the Army was issuing poles and stakes with them as well. So, but the Sibley tent held on in Army usage until World War I. You see stateside units using them. And the Sibley stoves were being used early in World War II. Because it's just a sheet metal cone with a little door in it, and very good at keeping things warm.
A lot of those were used by the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Oh, real? Okay.
In the 30s. They're slightly different, but they are certainly the Sibley design.
The stove or the tent? The stove, okay.
And possibly the tents, but certainly the stoves. And you see some of them for sale as the original Sibley, and they're not. They're the ones made in the 30s for the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Any other questions? Again, the main attraction now down at the park is primarily surrounding a Pueblo and a Mission ruins trail. It's still very scenic. You can go to the park and get permission to go to the 2 other locations there, but you have to get like a special pass.
And the weekend of the Living History Weekend at Pecos, they do have tours. You can load up in a van and drive along the battlefield area and stop and get out.
And again, we do have some of the flyers there, and actually a little later we can actually call up the website, and they really have kind of a cute wrap
Oh, that's right.
of what's
I wouldn't call it
Paul,
cute.
certain people that it'll give you kind of an idea of what it's like. So again, if you end up ever traveling down towards Santa Fe, just make a slight turn off there and visit it. It's really quite nice.
Yes.
You mentioned Gloria Swanson's house.
Yes.
Or Greer Garson, thank you, yes. Yeah, Kozlowskis Ranch over the years has been kind of cut up and redistributed, and Greer Garson and her, I can't remember her husband's name. I think his nickname was Buddy, if I remember correctly. What?
No, I'm listening to him.
Mr. Yeah. The Kozlowskis Ranch is now known as the Forked Lightning Ranch, and after her husband died, part of her son inherited part of the ranch, but what's left is what she owned until she donated it to the National Trust and the Conservancy, and then it was sold to the National Park Service. And so what is there today was originally Greer Garson's property. And so the National Park Service has been restoring the original Pueblo building there. And of course, not Pueblo, I mean Adobe. And of course, Adobe just needs constant care. Otherwise, it just melts and falls apart in the elements. And the General Sibley's goal, Fort Union, you can visit that site as well. There are still parts of the walls remaining of the warehouse and some of the other buildings there. Most of the walls for the officers' quarters are gone, but the fireplaces are still there. And when you walk the site, you can see why the Texans wanted to get there. It's a very large fort, and you can see how large the warehouse area was. And you can just imagine how much materiel and munitions were stored there. So it was a very worthwhile target for the Confederacy to try and capture. And it makes a really great tour. Yes?
I might point out that there are several books written on the New Mexican campaign. The one you mentioned, Rebels on the Rio Grande, which is a journal of Sergeant Petacolas, is a wonderful book. This is also quite a good book written by Don Albert, who was one of the original historians of that area. Did a lot of archaeological digging in that area. Identified, at least to his satisfaction, and I assume it's right, the locations of various units. There are several other books on this. Actually, considering how small the conflict was, there's an awful lot written about it. And I'm sure Sven can tell you some of the other books available. I could too. I thought we were going to have them here, but Rich didn't show up, so he didn't read the books. But if you're interested in reading about it, we can give you some information about where to get the information.
And there was a fella in the mounted company, Company F, for the Colorado Volunteers. His name was Ovando Hollister, and he wrote a book. He published it in 1863 called "Boldly They Rode," and it's about his experiences during the fighting. And actually, when he enlisted and his duties before he marched or rode south, and When he published it, there was only 1,000 copies made, and then it was reprinted in the late 40s. So there are a few libraries around that have it, but if you have a Kindle, you can download it, and it's only like $4 or so, and it makes for a really good read. It's called Boldly They Rode. So are we out of time? Or?
Well, any other final questions? Well, Sven, thank you so
my
much
pleasure.
for joining us today. I owe you a challenge, one-part challenge.
Oh, wonderful.
Just before we formally end up, Lou, would you come forward, please? We have a short presentation here.
We tried to make a little presentation for all the guys who worked hard for us on the board, served many years. One of the individuals is here today, Joe Lutz. Joe was basically the handyman. If anything needed fixing, if anything needed build, he would take care of that. Still does, as a matter of fact. And so, in amongst the things that he built was his own present. So, Joe said, if you could make it up here, we have this this little pen set. We took the liberty of adding your name to what you made. So now you're going to take this home. Your wife is going to ask, Joe, what the heck?
Then you turn them in. Thank you.
Sure. Now, he's too embarrassed to wear it, but when he resigned from the board, we decided he deserved the medal. Now, Joe had served in the Navy for 3 years and claimed that he never got the Good Conduct Medal because he had only served 3 years. I pointed out, I only served 3 years, I got one. He didn't get a Good Conduct Medal because of his behavior. But we honored him anyway. And Bill Bacon made up a Good Donut Medal, which he's too embarrassed to wear, apparently.
Now he has it framed it, it's hanging in his bedroom.
Well, thank you so much again for joining us. Please don't run off. We still have some refreshments. Please come up and talk to Sven and Bob and look at all the marvelous items they brought with us today.